_ thank you. We have another Throwback Thursday for you here on Dakota News Now at 9 a.m.
Joining us this morning is Lori Kent with the Local Loop podcast. How are you?
Good morning, guys.
I was just telling you before this, I've never gotten to do a Throwback Thursday, so I'm excited. So what do you have in store for us today?
I think it's a good one. But so last week we got to explore the history behind the Glidden Memorial Chapel, and we found out that they're doing some fundraising. They want to make sure this chapel's around for another 100 years. And that's all at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. But behind the gates of Mount Pleasant Cemetery, it holds so much more history than that. Starting with the gate posts themselves, they were donated by Inez Van Epps. Now, she and her husband William were pioneer merchants here in Sioux Falls when we were just beginning to be a little town. So they did well, and William ends up dying many years before Inez does. And so she has plenty of years of visiting Mount Pleasant Cemetery. She ends up donating 15 more acres of land to the cemetery, a place called Sunset Slope. And I personally think this is one of the best places in Sioux Falls to catch a sunset. It's gorgeous. But there's also over 180 Civil War veterans that are buried at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And this is fascinating because they all ended up here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. One of them being Colonel Melvin Grigsby. And he actually served in the Civil War and ended up being a prisoner of war at one of the most infamous prison camps, Andersonville. He ends up here in Sioux Falls, and he writes a book called The Smoked Yank. And in 1873, when Mount Pleasant Cemetery is being assembled, there's 20 acres of land, and they pick something that's very east of town. They're like, the town will not touch the cemetery. Well, we had 150 people in Sioux Falls at the time. We've grown, and the cemetery is now surrounded by homes. It's basically within a neighborhood, which I think makes it pretty unique. Now, this isn't the last historical marker at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. They actually have one more, which means if you're keeping count at home, we have one National Register of Historic Places building, 2 historical markers, over 180 Civil War veterans. Wow. So this is such a great place to start learning about our history. And one last thing is there's kind of a game you can play when you go there. So Inez Van Epps, William Van Epps. Now the name Van Epps might sound familiar to you. Like the park. So if you walk around Mount Pleasant Cemetery, you can pick out headstones that actually are either park names or street names. So starting with E.A. Sherman, Sherman Park, Helen McKinnon, McKinnon Park. We have Phillips, we have Waltz, we have Van Epps. Those are all street names or parks. So it's a really fun game that you can play to kind of connect pieces of our history.
That's so cool that you can go to one place and find so many things. You can play the game, like you said, visit the 2 historical markers, the National Historic Building, and then all of this. It's really a one-stop shop for history buffs. So
totally agree.
yeah. I think that's super interesting. And is there any resources online? I know last week we talked a little bit about the fundraising they were doing to preserve these historical markers. Is there anything that the public can do to help preserve these?
Absolutely. Mount Pleasant Cemetery does have a fundraiser going. You can go through their website, and also on locallooppodcast.com, you can kind of explore little bits that I've done on the cemetery. I do actually have a podcast that's on this historical marker.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Always the best part of my
I
Thursday.
know, always.
Love the Throwback
so
Thursdays.
interesting.